Exclusive.
Make it here, make it anywhere, yeah. It's that deep, and it's hard to have a dream in a city that never sleeps. The apple is rhyme, but so is the worm in it. Name the city twice, gotta double up the earn in it. Ain't nothing faster than a New York minute. So I wear a white tee with a blue authentic fitted hat with the...
And I think a lot of what I've become interested in as a scholar, and I see my work fitting in somewhere between ethnography and more towards oral history, since I do a lot of interview-based research. But I've primarily been interested in looking at Asian Americans in hip hop and what their role has been and what they've gotten out of it, and partially because it's not a story that's really told very much, perhaps for good reasons. But I think that there's something interesting about hip hop's, certainly its influence and its expansion and its transformation of multiple communities. And this has been one area that's really interested me throughout my work. And I think more recently, I'm coming to understand that the two of the things that I'm trying to understand within how Asian Americans and hip hop intersect is really around how hip hop is both powerful and pleasurable. And I think when I first began this, it was really all about the power, because I always thought of hip hop as being something that was primarily about transformation through power, about speaking truth to power. And it's not to say that those things are no longer true, they certainly are. But I think as I grow older, I understand better also the pleasure of performance and the pleasure of participation and consumption and how that motivates people and what they get out of those things, especially in the realm of performance. So I think where I'm trying to push my thinking more is to not lose sight of sort of the issues of how power is being engaged, but also sort of the pleasure principle of it and what it is about pleasure that, again, motivates us, creates communities around seeking to create these moments of pleasure and to be able to participate in it.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I want to thank Oliver for mentioning David Sanjak. He was a very important person for all of us, and I'm sure for many, if not all of you as well. And he was also somebody, in addition to seeing him at EMP, but being in New York, he was somebody that was always available and just really supportive of a lot of people in a non-ostentatious way. If you didn't know him, I feel sorry for you, but if you go around and talk, and I'm sure this will come up more in years to come, there is a huge number of people that he helped in various ways that it just never, people never thought to mention it because it was between him and them, but he was always very supportive of me, just particularly emotionally when I was having a difficult time dealing with the academic world and so forth. And I think we all owe him a lot. And I personally feel like I owe him a lot in the sense of passing that along to other people, particularly younger scholars, because he was somebody, people don't talk about this, but he was universally recognized as a brilliant person, and also had a lot of difficulty fitting into the academic world. And I think people don't like to talk about that because they feel like it's insulting to him, but I feel like it's insulting to him to not talk about that, because I think that's much more of an indictment of the academic world than it is of him. And for me personally, that's something that I think is really, really important to keep alive. So now I forgot what the other things were that I was going to say. Actually, that kind of ties into I was just thinking when you guys were talking, the idea of thinking about sort of what are the principles that you're working on with your ethnography is interesting to me, because I talk about principles a lot, but I talk about principles within hip hop. And in terms of principles of ethnography, I think I tend to follow the standard ways of thinking about ethnography that are taught in anthropology and ethnomusicology. And I guess I came to this later on a theoretical level. It was more just on a personal level, which is as somebody that was interested in hip hop, starting in the late 80s, and then becoming more involved in it as a fan and then as a writer. The idea that people were writing about hip hop in a way that made me uncomfortable, almost on a moral level, like just a sense of basic decency in terms of the way you interact with the hip hop community as a person. Seemed to me to be getting lost in a lot of things. So for example, there was, and to some degree still is, a lot of speculation about people's motives and intentions in the hip hop world when you could just ask them. Like, why did you do that? And rather than sit in an office somewhere and be like, well, I think this, and it's particularly glaring in hip hop, especially as somebody that lives in New York, when the people live like 2 blocks away from you, you know? And they're still alive, the hip hop pioneers. I see Cool Herc around all the time. You know, all these, and this is something we talked about earlier too, sort of this weird generational thing with hip hop being founded by people that were so young, that now they have the level of historical figures that have been around for 40 years, that have been significant for 40 years, and they're still only like 50, because they started when they were 10. It's an incredible resource for scholars. We have access to these living historical figures. They're not going to be around forever. And the idea that we're just blithely ignoring them in order to hear ourselves talk is just irritating to me, to be totally honest, just on a personal, like, moral level. I just find it insulting. So that annoyance, I think, is a big motivator for me, and a kind of idea of I don't want to reproduce that just as a way of because I would just feel bad if I wrote about hip hop in that way. And it reminded me, Alvaro was talking about being a journalist. An example of this for me, and I don't mean to make myself out as like a super moral person or something like that. I'm just somebody that's like kind of obsessive about this. I think that's more in the realm of a neurosis than kind of moral quality. But you asked what motivates our scholarship. So I started writing about hip hop in a journalistic capacity in the 90s, and I was writing for this magazine called Flavor, which was an independent hip hop magazine in Seattle, which I know Oliver knows about. Back when all hip hop magazines were small, independent hip hop magazines, pretty much, and everybody knew each other and everything. And the first thing I pitched to them, which was the first thing I wrote about hip hop in a journalistic capacity, was I want to go to the Society for Ethnomusicology conference in Los Angeles this year, which was 1995, and review all of the hip hop papers that people give. So, in other words, I felt like if I was going to write about hip hop for an academic audience, I want to write about hip hop academics for a hip hop audience. Like, if I'm going to talk about hip hop people to academics, I want to also tell academic people. And I think Emery and I were talking about this. I gave a talk a couple of years ago, and I posted on Facebook. I'm about to go to this university and talk about hip hop behind its back. And I often feel that way when people are talking about hip hop in an academic context, and I just feel like it's important to be really conscious of that, and self-conscious about that, and I think that motivates the nature of my scholarship on a lot of levels. I don't say anything in print that I wouldn't say to somebody's face, which I think is also an issue in a lot of stuff. You can tell when you read a lot of hip-hop scholarship, and because of the implications of that. You can tell when people write hip-hop scholarship that they know they're not going to have to answer to the community for it. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I think that can be liberating in the sense that it gives you a certain freedom. But I think that's much more than outweighed by the negative implications, which is clearly that you're not going to have to defend yourself to people that know what they're talking about. And people, I think, as we can all, I don't want to get into a whole negative thing, but I think we could all give examples of really glaring errors about hip-hop that have been factual errors in hip-hop scholarship. And I'll end with this, and I don't think I'm telling tales out of school, because I'm not going to name any names. There is no particular example, but Jeff Chang told me once that he has and I'm assuming all know who Jeff Chang is. He has a standard practice when he's asked to review a hip-hop book, a book about hip-hop, which is he opens it to a random page and reads from 5 pages before that to 5 pages after that, and if he finds more than 10 factual errors, he throws the book away. And he told me he's thrown a lot of books away. Excuse me. So I'll just leave it at that.
I'm going to weigh in just a little bit to tell a little bit of my story, but I'll keep it quite brief. I was trained in anthropology. I'm actually, I think, unique in this group in that I didn't have any journalist experience or any real writing experience outside of the academy, and I've been in the academy pretty much all along. But I came into hip hop from an anthropological training, and really as a way of, I'm building off of what people are saying here, but as Oliver was talking about creating new spaces and doing new projects, I really saw an importance of seeing what hip hop meant to people on an everyday ground level, not so much focusing on artists, although it's notable that in working with the Bay Area and working with underground artists in the Bay, and that's what a lot of my work was on, I was working with artists and working with people who do, mostly people who make music, but I was working with people who participate, but it was largely from this kind of ground level, how are they, people no one knows about, they don't necessarily have large names, they certainly aren't known nationally, and how do they make sense of hip hop? And particularly at the time, I saw a lot of interesting things going on with race, at the, I would say more at the do-it-yourself level, and that's particularly prominent in the Bay Area. So that was a natural site that I went to. However, one important thing for me was to always kind of being trained in anthropology and being trained in recent developments in it, over the last 20 years, but that have really looked critically, 20 or 30 years, but that have really looked critically at a lot of the traditions within the discipline. And a lot of anthropology has a terrible history. I mean, of otherizing, of keeping distance, and the new anthropology, as I like to call it, which not everyone subscribes to, but most of us look to, really involves dialogic principles, ideas of sharing, and ideas of, anytime that you're doing research within a community, you're benefiting from the generosity of people in that community. And it was really important for me to share myself, to share who I was, in the interview process, or sometimes after the interview process, because sometimes you hear your voice too much in the interview, to tell my story back to people. And I found myself in this world of hip-hop artists who were just making songs every day in their bedrooms. They might not be necessarily going anywhere. And this was, I would say, a little bit, it wasn't anything big in the Bay Area, but today we kind of think about that with GarageBand and with MySpace pages. We think about that as, okay, as an everyday, or it's not that unusual. But I think at this time, it was a little more unusual, not in the field where I was, not in the Bay Area. But in sharing these stories, I found that, and in sharing some stories about my own attempts to write raps in high school or little things like that, even though I was really going in saying I'm not trying to involve myself in this community to that level, to be a practitioner, I realized that everybody within the community that I was doing work didn't see a line between being a fan and an artist, between being a consumer and a participant. And more I was asked, well, you're at every open mic, why don't you ever get on stage? We know you like this music. Why is that a big step for you? Every day we're making songs in the house and you're hanging out with us. Why don't you, I know you've written a rap before, why don't you get on a song with us? And more I saw how unusual I was creating this line and how unusual it was. And really in a sense of, in a sense of rhythm and improvisation, and here I'm kind of going along the lines of what Ali was saying, there's a rhythm to field work, or to doing any kind of research with human beings, but human beings, this isn't an object that you're looking at, this is an alive world that's making sense of you, that's making sense of your behavior, that's moving while you're trying to do research within.